Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This week, we got some fun new information from USCIS and DHS on the Form I-9 and updates in the verification process. With me today is Jenna Bishop, and she and I have been doing a deep dive and honestly and truly geeking out about these new changes. So we thought we might share them with you, what we've learned and what we think the best practices are moving forward.
So as a disclaimer, the information that we are giving you today in this presentation is accurate as of today, August 2nd, 2023. It may still change, hopefully it doesn't, but just wanted to throw that out there. Also, we are not attorneys, so none of the information contained within this presentation should be construed as legal advice. So with that, just to introduce myself real quickly, my name is Jenna Bishop. I am a senior management consultant with Helios HR. I'm in my 3rd year here, and I've been in HR for over 14 years. I do also have my SPHR certification, and my main focus is compliance, particularly multi-state and government contractor compliance. Part of what I do here at Helios is kind of stay on top of the trends, regulatory changes, and just make sure that our team and clients are kept up to date as best I can. And I will pass it over to Melissa to introduce herself.
Hello, so I am Melissa Hajjar. I am a management consultant with Helios HR. I too am in my 3rd year with Helios, and I've been in HR for over 17 years now. I have my PHR. I also have a certificate in mediation. I specialize in many things, but 2 of them include compliance and HR operations. So that's in particular why this has been interesting to us. So without further ado, let's jump in. Here is sort of a roadmap for today's conversation and the information we plan to share with you. We're going to first go over what has changed. We're going to set up baseline terminology, make sure we're all communicating from the same perspective. We're going to go over the new form, give you some ideas about a plan of action for moving forward, cover some of the most common mistakes we see with employers when we come in to do I-9 audits, and also go over some of the most frequently asked questions we receive and the resources we've pulled together for you.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's talk about what has changed. Full disclosure, Melissa and I were both very excited to see all these updates come through. They're basically the first major changes that we've really seen in a long time to these types of processes. So first up, we have a new condensed Form I-9. It is shorter, it's more streamlined. As a note, you can continue to use that October 2019 version through the end of October this year, so October 31st, 2023, or you can switch to the new version sooner if you choose to do that. Also new, the virtual verification process is here to stay. It's not going away as we previously anticipated. So you've asked and DHS has provided us with that option. They also added a checkbox in to indicate whether you are not using that virtual verification option to review your documentation for your employees. They also made some changes to the translator, preparer, and reverification sections. They've been relocated to supplements rather than within that second and first page of the I-9. We also have an updated employer handbook, so much more detailed instructions, pretty pictures of all the documentation that you can gather, abbreviations, all kinds of stuff in there. So if you want to take a look at that, not light reading by any means, but it has a ton of information. We also have enhanced accessibility, so you can actually access the I-9 on mobile devices and tablets. And then we noticed some additional updates. So the use of alien has now turned into non-citizen. We have additional guidance on receipts. We have the removal of the NA requirement. So instead of having to write NA in all those blank fields, you can just leave them blank now, which is great. We're super excited about that, actually. And then we have improved acceptable documents list.
Jenna, I do find it kind of funny timing that all of a sudden the government is very intentional about changing the terminology from alien to non-citizen. With the recent headlines, this little component just kind of gave me a chuckle. So
yeah. We need to make sure we differentiate.
Right, we need to differentiate that moving forward. So speaking of differentiating, let's talk about terminology for a second. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure we're all communicating from the same space. We're going to use a lot of these terms as we go forward, and we want to just make sure that we all have the same understanding. There's 2 different things that are really happening here with these changes. One is the virtual verification for your new hires moving forward from today on, from August 1st when they published this, right? This is a new method that if you're an employer in good standing and you wish to use E-Verify moving forward, you can utilize a live video interaction where the employee literally holds up their passport or their whatever document they choose, because they get to choose. They hold up their document and you verify that through a video, that you have to be compliant and in good standing with E-Verify to do that, to participate in that virtual option. The second thing that's happening is the re-verification of your existing active employees. So your employees who did a virtual verification under the COVID exemption must now be re-verified, and that has to happen by August 30th. Why not August 31st? I'm not sure, but it has to be done by August 30th. If you're in good standing with E-Verify, you can do this re-verification also via live video. If during COVID, you never did a virtual verification and you only verified them physically with the actual documents in your hand, you actually don't need to take any action outside of implementing the new I-9 form. All of this verification, re-verification, if you're not doing virtual and you never did virtual, there's no action in that component that you need to do moving forward unless something changes. But if you did a virtual verification, no matter which method, you have to re-verify your employees by August 30th. One of the frequent questions we get is what an authorized representative is and what it isn't. They actually changed this back in 2019. An authorized representative can be anyone the employer designates to complete Section 2 on their behalf that's in the physical presence with those documents. So that can be anyone, your neighbor, the barista at your local coffee shop, your Mahjong or poker buddy, right? It can be anyone. We often add the guideline for our clients that it is somebody over the age of 18, preferably somebody that's not related to you. I've had people go out into the street and flag down a neighbor walking their dog for the afternoon walk, right? You can get creative with it. It does not need to be a notary. It does not need to be a bank teller, right? So it's just that authorized person that the organization allows to complete that Section 2 on your behalf. Section 1 and Section 2, I want to define that because clearly we're already using that terminology. Section 1 is the employee information where they attest to their citizenship and that the information they're providing is truthful under law, right? This is a legal document. I want to also add, this has to be done by their first day. It's a common misconception. You can send it anytime after they send their offer letter, sign their offer letter, but they have to complete Section 1 by the end of their first day. Bonus tip, only employees can make corrections to this section. If you do an audit, if you discover an error, a missed translator box on earlier forms, only employees can make those corrections to Section 1. Section 2 is for employers. That's where you can make any of your edits, changes, additions, marking through something, right? That's your section where you're attesting that under law, this information is truthful or your representative is saying that. Only the employer can make corrections in this space. Now, the cool thing, and we'll show you this in a second, Section 1 and Section 2 are now on the same page, which is kind of neat. But that is, we'll head there in a second. The last thing I want to cover from a terminology perspective is in good standing. When you look at the legislation and what's been issued in the register and the handbooks, you'll see this phrase everywhere. And basically what this means is that you registered with E-Verify, that you, as an employer, have signed what's called a memorandum of understanding. It's the agreement that you will participate moving forward, and that from that date that you signed that under MOU, it's called an MOU, from that date that you signed the MOU, moving on, every single new hire gets processed through that site. Now, if you decide that site A uses E-Verify and is going to do virtual, and then site B is going to still do physical verifications, that's totally fine. But you need to make sure that any population who is using E-Verify under policy, that each one of those new hires gets processed through that site. So without further ado, Yes, complete with drum roll. Here is your new I-9 form, all shiny and new. It is one page. It has combined. You will notice that the translator box, one of our top 10 things that are missed that we see when we do I-9 audits for employers, is no longer there. As Jenna mentioned, it is available now as a supplemental page and is only needed if the employee uses a translator or preparer to help them complete the form. Additionally, you don't see here the reverification block. That also has been moved to a supplemental, supplement B, and only needs to be used if you need them. Now, you may giggle like we did, or not, because we're HR nerds. We kind of giggled at how they did them. There's some redundancies there. If you need to re-verify an employee 4 times, you now have 4 different sections that you can do that. So they needed to fill up the page, but at least they're not on that main page, that you won't need to take up that space unless you actually need to use them. I know this is small, so let's look a little bit closer. Here is section 1 in a way that you can actually read it. And this is the example from the DHS site. So I noticed a couple of things right away. One is we no longer need to use the NA for not applicable if the information isn't there. If they don't have an apartment number, you don't need to list NA. Same thing with other names used. You can just go ahead and leave those fields blank. The other thing I noticed when I was actually playing and typing in the form, it will correct, if you put the phone number in without punctuation, it'll correct that for you. It will not correct you on your date, which is one of the things that they most commonly look for if they come in for an audit. So make sure you're following the format that's listed in the instructions on the form. In this case, it's the date field. You want to make sure you're using 2-digit month, 2-digit day, 4-digit year. The other thing is that next thing we noticed was that, believe it or not, I have seen some people check more than one immigration status on their form. This new updated digital form will not allow employees to select more than one citizenship option. It also provides a more condensed space for filling in that additional information if they check option 4. There's also a signature space and the date. You'll see the link to the preparer translator certification, the addendum that will get added if that's needed. I want to point out here too, just typing digitally signed or typing your name does not constitute a digital signature under DHS guidelines and according to the DHS handbook. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but it's an important time to call that out here. So let's take another look at section 2. So this is the portion that we get to play in. It looks very similar with the layout. You still have one item from list A or one item from list B and one item from list C. But you'll see in that additional information block, this new little checkbox right down there at the bottom. Check here if you used an alternative procedure authorized by DHS to examine documents. This is what you'll check when you annotate later. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the plan of action, but I wanted to call out this is your little checkbox to use if you do use the virtual verification or re-verification procedure moving forward. If you're doing physical verifications, you don't need to check that box. The other thing I want to call out here is that they've made some little changes to the signature block component. It's no longer a separate block, and that first day of employment is contained within it, so you don't miss it. A lot of people miss it because it wasn't in that table, so now it's included in there, so hopefully it won't be as easy to miss. The name for the signer has also changed, and you want to, again, follow the format that they lay out for you. So instead of it being in separate blocks, you want to do last name, comma, first name, and then either the title, your title as a representative of the organization, or authorized representative, if it is that authorized representative. That's all combined into one block now, as is the business name and address. It's all in one line. So I know this is we've covered a lot in a very short period of time, but you may at this point be confused. Okay, what do I actually need to do with all of this information and all of these definitions? So Jenna's going to help us figure that out.
Yeah, so before we talk about the plan of action, I just want to note now is a great time to do an I-9 audit if you can, if you have time for it. It's really a good opportunity to make sure you have all your ducks in a row and make sure all your I-9s are clean and compliant. We will talk a little more about this later, but there is speculation that there will be an increase in audits with all the changes. And just to be fair, it may be more than speculation. If you read through the Federal Register information, that was released about this update, there are notes in there that ICE will monitor how things are going and whether or not this new process is working well. And the way that they do that is through audits. So great opportunity to take advantage and do your I-9 audits now. With that said, let's talk about what a plan of action might look like. So really there's two different decision points here. So we have re-verification for your current employee population, and then we have the verification for all your new hires moving forward. So in this conversation that we're having today, we're going to focus a lot more on the re-verification just because it is a very complex component with this looming deadline of August 30th. So we want to make sure we really go over that in detail. So for any employees that you've hired between March 30th and July 2023, if you have virtually verified those folks, this is what your re-verification process is going to look like. The first off, you're going to determine your list of employees who are affected. Look through all the I-9s that you've done since March 2020, determine if they were physical. If they were physical verifications, good to go. Don't worry about them. If they were virtual verifications, there is action here. So you need to determine your methodology once you have that list of employees. Are you going to virtually verify them? And that will apply if you were an employer enrolled in E-Verify in good standing during that time frame. So during that March 2020 to July 2023. So I just want to be really clear about that. If you sign up for E-Verify today, you can do that process, the virtual verification with your hires moving forward. But for anyone who is virtually verified, if you weren't enrolled in E-Verify at that time, you will need to do the physical verification. If you were enrolled in E-Verify and you were running everyone through E-Verify and examining virtually, you still have action, unfortunately. So you still do need to virtually verify their identification or physically if you prefer to do it that way. And by virtual, just to be clear, we're not talking about looking at copies of someone's documentation. We're talking about having a Zoom call or a Teams call where you and the employee are there and your employee says, here's my passport, ID, whatever, and shows it to you. And you are seeing that over a live, what they're calling live video interaction. So just want to be clear about that. So once you've determined what method you're going to use, you want to communicate to all your employees because they need to gather that documentation. We'll go more in depth on like what all these processes mean and how all that looks in just a second. So I'll kind of leave it there for now, but make sure you're communicating so your employees can get their documents together. Quick note, if their document is expired now, but it wasn't when you first did the I-9, that's okay. I know we're used to saying no expired documents, but if they had it originally when you did the I-9, so let's say in April of 2020, I did someone's I-9, their passport wasn't expired. Now it's August 2023 and it is expired, that's okay. You're going to have the I-9s returned to you. You're going to review each and every one because this is, again, is your liability to make sure that everything is accurate. And then you're going to retain and store your I-9s. And we'll talk more about what storage looks like specifically for I-9 documentation and all those associated things that go with the I-9. And as a reminder, this is all due by August 30th. Your verification process probably is going to look kind of similar to how your re-verification process looks. And this is for anyone hired from August 2023 forward. So again, determining your methodology, communicating with your employees, reviewing all the I-9s and making sure that you have them all in the same place that's accessible to you as the employer, and then retaining and storing them as the guidelines are kind of laid out by DHS, and we'll talk about what that is as well. One thing I do want to note too is that if you are not familiar with E-Verify, that is a system that you can use to basically run in I-9 information. So you take the information that the employee put on their I-9, you run it through the E-Verify system, and it compares that information to what's in DHS and SSA records, so Department of Homeland Security and Social Security Administration, and it will confirm if it matches or not. So just wanted to throw that out there. If you do sign up for E-Verify, there's a ton of training, so you'll learn a lot more about the system, but just wanted to make sure that people are aware of what we're talking about when we say E-Verify, now that we've kind of run that past you a bunch of times. So with that, let's talk a little more about what virtual verification looks like. Again, this is live video interaction, not just looking at copies that were sent over. So first off, the employee is going to send you the copy of the documentation, because that does need to be stored with the Form I-9. You want to make sure that the copy includes the front and the back. You'll review it. You make sure it looks reasonably genuine to you on just looking at it. Say, okay, this looks like this belongs to this person, and it looks like it's a valid document. You're going to do the live video interactions. So Melissa and I are going to meet via Zoom. She's going to show me her passport. I'm going to go, okay, that looks like Melissa, and that looks like a real passport. Good to go. I'm going to make an annotation on the I-9 saying that I have viewed her documents, and we'll talk a lot more about what the annotation looks like, because there is very specific guidance on what you need to enter in that additional information field. And then you're going to store all those relevant documents separately and securely, and we'll talk more about what that means in a few. So that's virtual re-verification. And again, this is the re-verification process. So now we'll talk about physical re-verification.
So I want to, again, we're hitting these keywords carefully because it can be confusing. It even confused us a little bit in the beginning, and keeping track of these threads carefully. This is the physical re-verification process. This is used if during the COVID exception, you took advantage of that and you did virtual verifications since March of 2020, you now have to physically or virtually re-verify those employees by August 30th. If you choose not to participate with E-Verify, not to use the virtual verifications moving forward, this is what that physical re-verification process will look like for your organization. So you'll commute just like you did in other things, right? You communicate with the employee. What is the timeline that you need them to respond by? What instructions do you have for them? What, in including the letter, an authorized representative instructions. We have a letter, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we have an HR toolkit for you that'll be available for you, and included in that is a template letter to the authorized representative. This is where I would attach it in that communication that says, "Hi, authorized representative. We're just asking you to see if this document looks legitimate to a reasonable person, and you're signing on our behalf. We're assuming all of that liability. Thank you." Thank you at the end, right? So you send that communication to the employee with instructions, deadlines, and attaching that authorized representative if they might be using it and not coming back to site. You do not need to fly your employees back into site unless you want to capitalize on it and use it for manager training or some other thing. One of my clients is doing a party. Everybody's coming back to the office. They're going to do their I-9s, but then they're also going to do an engagement celebration, employee appreciation lunch. You could use that too. So you send out your instructions, you then meet with the employee, you physically touch and hold the documents, you take a look, they appear to be genuine, you annotate the form. We're going to talk about that in a second, but you annotate the form on the original I-9 if you can. And this is important here because up until August 1st, they were telling us that their recommendation was to complete a new Form I-9. In all of the new information that they released this week on August 1st, we're seeing that's gone. So we still see that the guidance that says if you need more space, use another form. So you still can use another form if that's a better methodology for you and if that's more efficient. But it does appear that their recommendation is now to note the original form if you can. That gets complicated to do, but we want to just kind of call that out for a second. So you'll annotate the original I-9 if you can, or you'll complete a new section 2 on the new form. This you'll take copies of the documentation that was presented to you and the annotated form. You'll scan those in, and again, you'll store those forms in a separate secure location for those employees, that they're easily retrievable, but they're also secure and only given to those visibility to those who need to know. So let's talk about it. As promised, let's talk about that annotation block, that additional information space that was on the last version on the I-9 form and is in the new version of this form as well. One commonality you'll see on all of these examples, and these examples were pulled directly from the DHS website and directly from I-9 Central, is that each one of them says remote inspection completed on and the date. So all of your I-9s for these active employees should already have the note that says that these I-9s were inspected remotely and the date in which they were inspected, right? So each one, no matter which option you have, those should be there. But depending on the re-verification method, that changes what in an annotation you use, primarily based on how that re-verification was done and also who was doing it. So in the first example, if the re-verification is done by physical inspection, holding the actual documents by the same person who completed it when the employee was hired. So Jenna did mine when I first started, and now I'm showing her my documents physically again. She can use that block, that second note that's in that field. It says COVID-19 documents physically examined on the date, and she can just list her initials because her full signature is already on that form. Now, it does need to say COVID-19. It's not that you need to look at their vaccine records. We've heard that question from our team as well. It's not that. It is only mentioning that it was done under the COVID exception, right? It's making mention of that exception, not any reference to any health records or vaccination records. Now, if the physical inspection is done by a different team member than who did my original I-9, then that person, instead of just doing their initials, they need to list their full name and their title, but everything else stays the same. The third option here is if this re-verification is being completed virtually. We're doing that virtual meeting where I've held up my passport and Jenna's viewing it and I've sent my copies, but she's not in the physical presence. In that case, instead of writing all of those other things, the employers, whoever's filling out and re-verifying would write alternate procedure examined on the date, and then they can initial. So it's a little bit of a different, depends on who's completing it and what method is being used, but it always will be on that additional information block.
Just as a reminder, that virtual verification is only available if the employer
Right.
was in good standing with E-Verified during that flexibility period of March 2020 to July 2023. So just want to make sure that we're really hammering that in. I know we've said it a couple times, but just making sure that everybody's aware. So if you're signing up for E-Verify now, you can certainly virtually verify moving forward, but those people that were verified previously, you still have to do the physical inspection. All right, so storage of information. So there's very distinct requirements on how you have to handle the storage and retention for I-9s. So first off, they need to be kept separate from your personnel files. So you want to make sure that you're not just throwing the I-9s in, but list that from those personnel files. We recommend keeping your terminated employees separate from your active employees. It just makes it a lot easier when you have to go in and purge. Speaking of which, for your separated employees, when you are ready to purge, we recommend actually keeping those by purge date, because then you can just go in and take them out when you're ready, whether that's taking them out of a physical file to shred them, or that's just deleting the file from your electronic records. And just while we're talking about purging, the rules for separated employees is you have to retain their I-9 for at least 1 year after their date of termination, or at least 3 years after their date of hire, and that's whichever one is longer. Copies of documentation. So you have to keep obviously a copy of the I-9 or the actual physical I-9 or your electronic version of it, but you also need to have a copy of the documentation, both front and back. That is required for virtual verification. If you're using E-Verify, you have to do that. If you're doing the physical inspection, technically you don't have to, but we do recommend that as a best practice to retain copies. Again, if you're doing the virtual verification, we do recommend that you also download a copy of the E-Verify case confirmation. So if that applies to you, we recommend keeping that with the I-9 as well, and then storing the I-9 with all that supplemental information together. So you've got your Form I-9, the documentation copies, front and back, the E-Verify case confirmation, not combination, and then any memos or corrections. So if you made a correction to the I-9 and you have attached a memo stating this is what I did and this is why I did it, keep all of that together so that they're all close and easily accessible. For the electronic storage components, if you are using electronic signatures, ensure you're compliant with the guidelines from USCIS. And in that employer handbook that we referenced earlier, there is a bulleted list of exactly what makes something compliant from an electronic signature standpoint. Melissa mentioned earlier, it's not just typing electronically signed by or typing in with the signature font. You have to be able to show that it was sent to the employee and that they received it and they signed it at the same time that they did the information entry. And you need to be able to produce copies of that if required. So it may be that your HRIS system is capable of this. Check with them, make sure. You may also want to use a system like DocuSign where you enter the employee's personal email address and you can show that it kicked off to them and that it came back from them. So just make sure you review those guidelines and that you're following that to make sure you're compliant with the electronic signatures. We also recommend making sure that you have secure options for your employees. People are going to be sending you copies of their passports, of their social security cards, and the last thing you want is to have someone's identity stolen. So finding a way to have people upload them securely or send them in a secure fashion, whether that's via secure email or some other method, but just make sure that there is an option to get that to you safely without compromising the information. And then on that same note, make sure you have enough space to store all of this. So if you weren't doing virtual verification or storing all this electronically before, check your systems, make sure you have the space and capacity to be able to handle all this information. And then make sure you restrict the access to the file. So traditionally, if you're doing physical files, that's a locked file cabinet, easy peasy. If you're doing electronic, just making sure you're locking down the access to those files. So only the people that need to get in there can get in there.
We had a client come find us for support because their I-9s were gone. They had scanned them all in and shredded them, and all that folder they failed to save. So the last thing I want to say, and it's a good transition into common mistakes, it's also a good idea to have backups. You want it that preserving that original dating, that you followed those original timelines in terms of the dates, is so important. And is it the end of the world if that happens? No, we can help you rebuild. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you have redundant copies, that you have some sort of a fail-safe in place if you are only using digital records. So that seems like a good transition for us into other common mistakes. We are called in often to help employers, right set. And some of these, oftentimes it is very frequently I-9s are one of our quick wins when we come in and work with an organization. These are the top things that we see that you can easily, if you do decide to do an audit, which we do recommend, these are some of the things to keep in mind as you take a look at that and the easy corrections you can make moving forward and for those forms that exist. So watch your date formatting. For whatever reason, this is super important to auditors when they come in and look. They want to make sure you're following that date format. Also, never use whiteout. The government is very particular, including on this form, about never using whiteout or backing out or destroying backdating or destroying documents, right? They want you to make any corrections through a simple strike through and add the new information, initial and date. I had a client that did an audit, identified all the errors, had attached the memo, but never actually corrected the I-9. So make sure that you're actually correcting the I-9 through a strike through, adding the correct information, making that correction, and then initial and date it. Make sure your I-9s are separate, keep them accessible, right? You want to make sure you're protecting that very sensitive information your employees are trusting you with. The other thing is you need to get to it quickly, right? In the event of an audit, you're going to have 72 hours to respond. You're going to need to produce the I-9, the documentations, any memos. If you use supplemental pages for translators or reverifications, you're going to need to produce all of that. So getting ahead of making sure your file and record system is in order so that you could produce that on a dime is very helpful. Like I said, you never want to backdate or destroy versions of the form. There's not enough room. If there's not enough room, just use a second I-9, a blank one, and just make whatever additions you need to on that blank form. They don't need to complete section 1 all over again, but you can attach it so that you preserve that initial information and that timing that you were compliant with the timing. Couple more common mistakes we see. documentation has to be legible. Sometimes we'll come in and do a mock audit for employers, and the copy is like gray and black. It's that old copier that barely works in the corner, right? You want to make sure that those copies are legible, because that's what the auditor is going to ding on if they cannot read that copy of that documentation. You also want to, make sure that those signature blocks are completed appropriately. Changing the font to cursive and then typing your name in, like Jenna said, is not acceptable from the DHS perspective on what a digital signature is. It has to be through a method like DocuSign or your HRIS, where it's validating who that person is that's signing the form. It needs to be date stamped, and it needs to be able to produce that record of that certificate if possible. A lot of the HRIS systems are doing that. So that might be something that if you go to print or pull that I-9, you might see that there. I know some systems are doing it. We want to make sure your system is doing it. We often find, I was talking to a few HRIS systems this week that didn't know any I-9 changes were even coming. So just because your system allows you to do something, whether it's here or somewhere else, does not mean it's compliant. So just make sure, we don't want you doing something that you think is compliant, but actually, right? So we want to make sure that you're doing this properly, because this is something that's important to the auditors. The other thing we want to talk about is if the name on the documentation matches the form. Obviously, for many of us, we change our name throughout our lives, or what's on our birth certificate, and our names, for whatever reason, might not match what our legal name is today. That happens, and that's valid. What employers can do is they need to just take a beat and talk about with the employee, make sure it's a valid reason for a name change. You don't have to ask for documentation, but you can. But if you do, the employee does not have to provide you with documentation. If I'm asked to provide documentation of my name change, I don't have to provide you with a copy of my marriage certificate or proof of that change. If the employee refuses to provide that documentation, the employer's response is, well, then you need to provide me with some additional form from that list, right? Something else then, but you can't require them to provide you with the documentation of the name change. Another common misconception, if you use a notary, which you don't need to do, but if you do use a notary, make sure they don't stamp or emboss or otherwise change that form. It's not necessary, it's not needed, and technically it specifically says in the DHS guidelines not to do it. So if you do decide to use a notary for whatever reason, that's fine, but they do not need the seal in any way, shape, or form. Don't go backwards. We heard this question a lot when all of this new legislation was coming. If you register with E-Verify that is moving forward. Any of your current and active staff are grandfathered in. They do not need to be processed through E-Verify. For a lot of organizations, that would be a massive lift. And by doing that, because you're not processing them within the first 3 days of employment, you actually could trigger an audit or you could trigger more action. Because you're processing a huge volume of people that are not within that timeline, within that window. This last piece is interesting to me, and it could have been around before, but we noticed it's repeated a lot through all of the newly published guidance, where before it wasn't nearly mentioned as often. Use the English version only. The Spanish version is only approved for work sites in Puerto Rico, or offices in Puerto Rico. There are many, many mentions to this within the newly published guidance, which indicated to us that that is definitely something that if it was around before, they want to make sure we know now. So we do. So we wanted to carry that forward to you. So
definitely something that I learned.
Right.
Yeah.
So building from the common mistakes, we thought we might go over some of the frequently asked questions that we get.
Yes. So first off, Melissa, if we are a new employer to E-Verify, we've never used it before, we just signed up, do we need to go in and submit all our current staff through the website? I know you just mentioned this, but it feels like a good time to say it again.
This may be one of the most common things we heard from even our own team members. So yeah, it's definitely worth repeating. No, please don't do that. Only submit your new hires. You're gonna register with E-Verify. Your admins are going to take that class. I think it's like an hour. They'll teach you all about the site, all of the different things. And then once you start and you've registered, every new hire after that date then needs to be processed through E-Verify within the first 3 days of employment. But all of your current staff, all of your former staff, they don't need to go through E-Verify. So Jenna, I have one for you. What if we only did physical verifications during COVID in the last few years? We never did any virtual verifications. What do we do?
You are good to go. You do need to decide what you're going to do moving forward, whether that's continuing physical verification or if you want to move to virtual. We talked about what those action items are. But as far as re-verification is concerned, you have no further action, though we do still recommend conducting an audit if you have time. It just gets you in good shape just in case you hit that audit list from the DHS or from ICE. So just puts you in, make sure that all your I-9s are nice and clean and tidy. So we do recommend that. Now, speaking of audits, if I discover an error on a previous form, what do I do?
They haven't made any changes to that correction process. If it's a minor error on the translator checkbox on that previous version of the form that we just retired got missed, which almost everybody did, the employee can check that box and initial and date. So you would make the correction, date, and initial by the appropriate party to make that correction. Now, substantive errors, like failure to submit the employee through E-Verify or to complete that section 2 by the end of the 3rd business day, those can't be resolved. Unless you have a time machine and you can go back, you can't fix that, right? So what you'll do, and in our toolkit, we have an audit log for employers. We also have an audit guide. But what you'll do is you'll make a note in the audit guide and the audit log, hey, I didn't complete Jenna's section 2 within the 3 days. It was completed outside of that window. You'll attach a memo to the I-9 that says, hey, we got it. But our understanding is that if you are otherwise, your I-9s are in order and you've corrected any minor errors and you've acknowledged and logged your substantive errors and moving forward from that time, you are following the procedures, the auditors will be a lot more lenient or have a tendency to be a lot more lenient with you. Obviously, it depends on the auditor assigned to you. I've also heard rumor the Chicago office is a little more particular than other offices, but that acknowledging and cleaning up those errors will go a long way if you should be audited.
I think we see that as a common thread too, right? Those good faith efforts really go a long way, just showing that you're cognizant and you're making the effort. One thing too, if you do an audit, you were in good standing with E-Verify, you were already using it, and you find someone that wasn't run through E-Verify, they do have the option to run that person through and just select, and it'll pop up hey, you're outside of the 3-day window. You can select that you ran an audit, you found out they weren't run, and that's fine. But that only applies for people who were employed when you were in E-Verify. So don't do that again for previous people, but just wanted to flag that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Jenna, what if we virtually verified an employee who's no longer with the organization? Do I need to go chase them down and find them?
No, avoid that awkward conversation. No, you don't need to go chase down your terminated employees. You do have action though. So it's not calling them or sending them an email or texting them. You can leave them out of it. You do need to find their I-9, and you just need to note in that additional information field that we keep talking about, just that they're terminated, they're separated from the company, and include their termination date. And that's all you have to do for anyone that's terminated. So if our company already virtually verifies, we're in good standing with E-Verify, do I need to do anything?
Feels like you shouldn't, but you do. They are they are mandating that all employers who did virtual verifications and are in good standing still need to re-verify those documents, repeat that procedure with those employees who were hired during the exception period and annotate the form, right? So you can do physical, you can do virtual, but you do need to take action and re-verify, even if that is re-holding up the passport again through a virtual live meeting, but it does need to happen once again by August 30th. I will say, though, you do not need to run them through E-Verify again. Don't do that. But you will need to re-verify and make a note on either the original I-9 or attach a new Section 2.
All right.
So Jenna, what if I want to do virtual verifications moving forward? Can I sign up for E-Verify? How do I even get started?
Absolutely. And actually, it seems from the guidance, at least from what I read in the Federal Register notes, that they want you to do that. So if you choose to do that, if you want to do this virtual verification process and you need to sign up, just go to everify.gov, click enroll on that top right corner, and that'll get you started. So you'll need to provide some information about your company. You'll need to sign the MOU that Melissa mentioned earlier, that memorandum of understanding, and then you need to enroll any of your new users. So anybody that is going to use that system for the purposes in which it was created, basically, and that's running any new hires through the system as they're hired within that 3-day window. All those new users need their own unique login, and all those new users are going to be required to take E-Verify training. So it may not be realistic to think that I'm going to sign up today and we'll start using the system today, but it's a quick process relatively, and then you just need to get your training taken care of, and then you can start using the system. Going forward, once you've registered, anyone that you're hiring does need to be processed within the system within 3 business days. So make sure that once you've got this set up, that you're ready to implement those processes and you're ready to move forward and start doing that as part of your I-9 process. So next step, what if I have an employee that doesn't want to do the virtual verification? We're set up in E-Verify, we have everything ready to go, we're virtually verifying everybody, and I have someone that goes, I'm not comfortable with this, I don't want to send you my documents via whatever method you've decided to receive those documents. What do I do then?
You fire them. No, I'm just kidding. You
So don't do that.
Right. Don't do that. Please don't do that. No, they have the right. They absolutely have the right. The guidance is very clear, that was published on August 1st, is very clear that if they do not want to, even though it's secure, however, the upload or the email's encrypted, they have the right to say, I do not want to be virtually verified. I need to do I want to do a physical verification. They can't do the reverse. They can't, if you're doing physical, they can't opt for a virtual. But if they're doing if you are doing virtual as an organization, they can request to do a physical and you have to comply. That might be a good time to use the authorized representative as well. It's important to note, however, that does not mean they're opted out from E-Verify. If you are an employer or they're working from a site for you that participates in E-Verify, they can't opt out of that. That is a requirement of their employment with you as an organization. That's a decision you've made, and their information will still be submitted to the government through that site. But they can do a physical verification instead of a virtual if they'd like to. So, Jenna, if my company doesn't keep copies of documentation, can I still participate in E-Verify?
Sure. But if you do, then you need to start keeping copies of documentation. So one of the requirements for using E-Verify is that you are keeping copies of all of the documentation that you receive, both front and back. So once your virtual verification procedure is in place and you're using that, you just need to make sure that you collect that documentation moving forward. And then just make sure, again, I know we mentioned this earlier, but make sure you're keeping everything secure together and easily producible if you are called to be audited by ICE. So Melissa, have any of the regulatory timeframes changed in terms of when sections need to be completed?
No, and in fact, employees can be sent the Section 1 immediately after they've signed the offer, not prior, but before they've signed the offer, and they can complete their portion at any time as long as it's by the end of their first day. You want to be careful not to send it before the offer because it could be construed as discrimination in some cases, in some protected categories. Employers then can only complete paid Section 2 in the first 3 days, and it has to be submitted through E-Verify if you're participating in the first 3 days. They did not change or lax that timeline at all, and they are still expecting employers to follow that guideline very closely.
And just to clarify too, when we say 3 days, it's 3 business days.
Correct.
I had to fact check that myself. So just wanted to make sure we're clear. When we say 3 days, we do mean 3 business days.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. That's important. So, hey, Jenna, is my HRIS or I-9 vendor automatically taking care of this for me? It's fine, right? I don't need to do anything.
Maybe,
Maybe.
maybe not. So, it's not necessarily the case. I would absolutely 100% recommend you check with your vendor. So whatever vendor you're using, whether it's HRIS or if it's a separate I-9 verification vendor, absolutely reach out to them, make sure that they're on top of this. What their timeline looks like would be helpful for you as well. And just make sure that they are able to support whatever verification method you decide that you want to use. So not necessarily. I know we like to say trust is great, but in this situation, we absolutely recommend checking with that vendor and making sure that they understand the rules and that they're following them and that they're compliant with them, because again, this will come back on you as the employer. So if things aren't done right, that's your liability. So you really want to make sure that you've got that all covered with your vendors.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, some
So
of the vendors didn't even know this change was coming. They were surprised and taking notes. It's like, oh, okay.
yeah, so and if they've already started talking to you about it, great. That's a great vendor, that's a great partner. But yeah, we absolutely
Awesome.
recommend just checking in with them and making sure. So does this mean we don't need to use authorized representatives anymore?
Maybe. One of my clients teases me that I say maybe a lot.
Maybe.
Maybe that could be very true for some clients. Any client and any employer who decides that they are going to use the virtual verification method for all of their employees moving forward and they're participating in E-Verify, they won't need authorized representatives because they won't need to give that authorization to someone else to be in the presence with the physical documents, right? That process is really changing. So, if the employer opts out of the physical examination, yeah, they won't need authorized representatives anymore. So, and this is one of the questions that I had when I first started seeing all of this new legislation. What do I do if the employee refuses to respond or participate in the re-verification process?
Yes, so not to be the bearer of bad news, but that's not an option. So ISA specifically said if you have an employee that says, nope, I'm not going to do the re-verification, we've already done this, unfortunately, you will need to separate the employment relationship with that individual. Now, again, we've mentioned before, if you have done physical verification and they've already presented you with physical documents, whether that's directly to you or through an authorized representative, this doesn't apply to those folks. So I really just want to be clear that this is for re-verification only. But if an employee refuses to participate in that re-verification process, you cannot continue the employment relationship. It's very similar to if someone is hired and they refuse to provide you documentation. So it's treated very much in the same way. You can't continue that relationship. So just want to make sure we are clear on that as well.
Yeah.
So with that, that's the end of our FAQ. So Melissa is going to provide you with some of our helpful resources that we've pulled together.
Yeah, absolutely. As you move forward, this is significant changes to what is a well-established process. Many of us, this is like old hat. We didn't even have to think about it. And now we have to go back and look at this again. It's important to make sure you're really being intentional and proceeding in the most effective way that works for your organization. Not every organization wants or needs to do virtual verification, or maybe some sites it works for and other sites it does not, right? So it's making that intentional effort, but also making sure your practices are consistent, right? That's a common thing that we've seen as well throughout the guidance, throughout every immigration attorney we've spoken with and learned from, is that you want to make sure you're not making anybody feel like they're being discriminated against or singled out. You want your practices to be consistent. So take a look at your organization, look at what makes sense for your operations, and then implement your process moving forward, both for re-verification purposes if it's needed, and also for your new hires moving forward. It's important. It helped me separate those two components out to figure out what the best process is for my clients as they move forward. So with all of that being said, we collected these things for you to help you as you go back to your practices and try to make sense of all of this new information. The first three things are free and available to you on I-9 Central and available in the other DHS and ICE resources. Then obviously, first and foremost is the new form. I would recommend taking a look at it yourselves, playing with it, type it out, type in it, live in it for a little bit, just kind of go through that flow and see how it works. You'll also see within that document and within those resources, the instructions. They've made those instructions shorter and they've moved some of that information that used to live there into that third resource, the employer handbook. So for example, you can still use abbreviations. They're just not listed in the new form instructions necessarily. They're listed in the handbook. So you don't need them to be in the form. So all three of those are great reference points. Even if you don't have them memorized like maybe Jenna and I do, you do know where they are and you can reference them if you're like, oh, I know digital signatures are a thing. Let me go reference that, right? Have those bookmarked so you can go access them right easily. In the days to come, we are finalizing our I-9 toolkit for you, for anybody who's viewed this program. You will be able to see it at helioshr.com. We'll have it right on our main page, so you just don't have to hunt for it too hard. And we're going to include the following things. We're going to include our audit guide, which includes some troubleshooting, some frequently asked questions. It's kind of a toolkit for you, as well as a log template. It's really a simple document, but it will give you a template for you to use, as well as a sample letter for those authorized representatives that just kind of gives you some language that you can kind of tailor that explains to them their purpose and thanks them for acting on your behalf, as well as a sample correction memo. These don't need to be fancy or long. It can be simple and you can just, that way you have something to jump off of. I always say it's easier to edit than build from scratch. So this gives you that jumping off point. And as always, you know, Helios HR, we are helpers. We love to help. We love to jump in. There's not a mess that we've seen that we couldn't help employers navigate through. So, you know, please never hesitate to reach out, whether that's conducting a mock audit or if that's support and being your reference and your support as you go through an actual audit, we can help with that. And any other HR solutions or support you may need, we're here for you.
So as Melissa mentioned, we are here for you. So here's our information. We've got our address, phone number, email address up here. We've also included our LinkedIn as well as our personal LinkedIn. So you'll see mine as well as Melissa's. Feel free to reach out to us. And also feel free to reach out for more information on Helios, how we can help support your organization's HR needs. We really appreciate you taking the time with us today and talking about I-9s. Super exciting content. I know Melissa and I were really excited about all these new changes. So hopefully we've been able to shed some light on some things that might have been a little hazy. And like I said, please feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to help. And thank you so much.
Happy I-9s.